Hi, everyone. Just before we get going, I want to remind you that everything we talk about and discuss should not be considered as investment advice. The purpose of what we talk about on Catherine Murray Media and Markets on YouTube, as well as Catherine Murray in Conversation With on my podcast, should be viewed as informational and entertainment purposes only. Please definitely do your own research, your own homework, and definitely consult an investment professional before making any investment decisions. And also to note, some of us might hold positions in some of the stocks that we discuss.
Ed, great to be able to catch up with you, and congratulations, I suppose, on retirement. I'm sure you're going to still be so busy and still involved to a degree at RIOCAN. But there's a lot to talk about in terms of what the world looks like, and I'd really like to kind of just start there in terms of your perspective. With COVID over a year into it, how are you viewing the world right now? What do you find interesting?
Well, my last year of being CEO was the COVID year. I mean, I formally retired on March 31st, 2021. So, the last year was certainly interesting. And, what I saw early on, and I have to admit, I think in company with our political leaders, I underestimated the impact this would have on our world. And probably like many other executives, I don't think I ever worked as hard as I did in that period from sort of March 2020 through to almost the end of 2020 calendar year. But, my initial thinking, and actually it just kept going, was that COVID was accelerating and would be almost like, a huge accelerant of many trends that we already saw happening and some that we never expected. I never knew about Zoom.
Right.
Zoom, Microsoft Teams, Google WebEx. I mean, there's all kinds of, but Zoom seems to be the phrase that people use for those kind of meetings, online meetings. And I think what we'll see, look, it'll never be the same as meeting in person, but it's very useful. I have no doubt we'll see a lot of that continue. So, on a simple basis, will business travel ever go back to the way it was? Probably not, because we found you can do a lot of things. So, I don't know if that's a trend that accelerated or a whole new trend. One that I despise, online shopping. I mean, essentially, that's all you've been able to do now for 14 or 15 months. And any retailer that didn't get their online presence beefed up and their whole logistical presence beefed up, it has fallen behind. And, I think people, I mean, I was in the States over the course of the winter. And you know what? People are dying to go back to stores. Down where I was, the stores were open and they were very busy. So I think the stores will be fine, but online shopping, which may have gone in Canada from probably high single digits to 10% of the overall retail market, probably has shot up to 25%. It won't go back down to 10. Maybe it'll go down a bit, but it'll probably done in 1 year what would have been an ordinary 5-year growth period because it was growing in it. So that has changed a lot. I mean, we haven't even gotten economics. I'm really focused on real estate. The whole thing about working from home, I'm one of, maybe because of my age, but I still believe people will go back to the office. Largely, they may not go back full time. The tenants, notwithstanding all the talk, have not given up their office space. Shopify probably being a notable example because they're a RIOCAN allied tenant in a couple of places at King and Portland in Toronto and our new development at the Well. And they haven't tried to walk away. And in fact, they had an option to expand their space, which they exercised in the building. So, I think the death of the office ain't going to happen. But having said that, moving to more sort of macro things, it's a very puzzling thing. You've got serious inflation in certain areas, raw materials. The price of lumber makes the news every day, so we know about that. But I can tell you, as someone involved in building things, costs of construction, which were going up probably 10% a year, starting about 4 or 5 years ago, largely because of demand and not that much supply. I've done mostly labor, has probably gone up 20% in the last year. And that's just a number I'm picking out of the air. And, it's one of the reasons you see for increasing prices. Actually, a friend of mine, and I don't know if we're going to see that here. We may already. I'm not that close to it. A friend of mine was looking at buying a house in Naples, and he was right down to signing the agreement. Now, being a very smart fellow, he actually read the agreement. And in the agreement was most people don't.
I know.
When they're
Wow.
buying from
You saw my
builders,
facial reaction. Yeah.
they figure, well, you can't change anything, so why bother? But he actually read it, went to a lawyer down there, and there was a clause in there that basically said that if the cost of construction, because the house hadn't been started yet, increased during the course of construction, or from the day they signed the agreement to the day they closed, and then there was a fairly complex way of calculating how much the price would go up. So in other words, he was buying a house that he really didn't know what it was going to cost.
Wow.
It was going to go up 10%, 20%. He wasn't sure. And with what we've seen, this was actually towards the early part of this past winter, so late 2020. And what we've seen in the last 6 months since then, for sure, it would have gone up materially. The cost of that. He didn't sign the deal, by the way. Of course, now he's sorry.
Right.
Because prices have gone up even more. But we haven't seen that in Canada yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if we did, because I know people, very successful projects, townhouse projects, one that RIOCAN's involved in Oshawa, of all places, which is actually part of the GTA now. And 153 houses, we sold them all, and healthy profit margin. But the last spreadsheet I saw on it, the last pro forma, our profit will be down a good 10 to 15% from what it was just a few months ago, because our sales price is fixed, but our cost wasn't all fixed. And again, because it's townhomes, a lot of lumber.
Right.
So I think you'll see some different ways of doing business a result. I mean, at its extreme. Again, I'm old enough. I remember until the big disaster of the early 90s, homes, obviously not high rise, but single family homes, even townhomes, were built on speculation, on spec. In other words, they built them first, then they put it up for sale. Now, the banks got hammered pretty good in the early 90s because of that, because it was mostly done with financing. And it was actually the banks that drove the whole way of doing business now. You don't build a home or anything else until you've got sufficient pre-sales, until essentially you build it after you sold it. But now when you've got quickly rising costs, who knows if that's not going to change.
Yeah.
But Ed, sorry, go ahead.
Just one question to pick up on that. When you think about the rise in costs, because that's obviously the big story around the world, is whether or not inflation is here to stay, or if it's transitory, and if it will only stay in certain segments of the economy. And of course, the reason why that's important is because we want to figure out, what the right price is, what the valuations are, and what the discount rate is going to be, and what the Fed will do, and therefore the Bank of Canada and every other central banker in the world.
Right.
What's your sense?
Well, right now, all the central bankers saying it's transitory. I mean, although at the same time, I think one of the things that's driving so much demand, whether it's housing or, quite frankly, the stock market, or it's private money chasing deals. I mean, I'm astonished by how much cash is out there, is, of course, the low interest rates, the governments around the world, Canada may be, out there leading the pack on a proportionate basis, but it's really around the world. In the old days, we'd say printing money. Now they just create money by buying bonds. I can't remember the number, 35% or 40% of the government bonds that are being sold in Canada are actually being bought by the Bank of Canada.
Right.
So they create money. With no disrespect to my friends in Newfoundland, if they didn't have the Bank of Canada buying, I'm not sure who'd buy their bonds. So they're stepping in where they have to, but they're just doing it as part of a general practice. So they don't believe this is permanent, that it's supply chain disruptions, that it's demand that's been tamped down. I mean, I see the price of oil. We're heading towards an oil-free economy, everybody says, but the price of oil is, I don't know, pretty good. Best it's been in the last few years, and I haven't filled up my car in a couple of weeks. Quarantine. From what I read, the price of gas is up, gasoline is up materially. And if the United States, which probably is 3 or 4 months ahead of us, at least, in sort of coming out of this pandemic, is any example, the cars are going to be on the road, and they're mostly SUVs,
right,
and trucks. So I'm not so sure that it's transitory. And I think if we saw, I think nothing much is going to happen with interest rates, and I think we've really seen how they are the driver of so much of the economy. I don't think anything much is going to happen with interest rates in the next 12 months. I think the central banks have defined a narrative, and they're going to wait to see it play out. In other words, let the rate of inflation prove them wrong,
right,
before they do anything. And but I have a queasy feeling that they might just be wrong, and that we might see an interest rate shock in 2022, or hopefully later rather than earlier, and that will affect everything. If suddenly they had to, they were afraid that inflation was getting out of control. I mean, a small little thing, but anecdotal evidence is the kind of stuff I live on. And we were having at the building, my wife and I have a place in Florida. They're having a problem getting valets. There's labor shortages everywhere.
Right.
And it's those sort of, I won't call them minimum wage job, but almost entry level jobs. And one day I actually saw the head valet of our whole complex running around and that's, I said, what's going on? Why are you working so hard? Old guy like you. And he says, we don't have enough people. He says, but it's okay. We've solved the problem. I said, how did you solve the problem? He said, well, I just hired 3 new guys yesterday, and now they're going to be training this week. I said, well, how'd you find them? He says, we raised our wages. We were paying our valets. Now keep in mind, this is Florida, not Canada, $10.50 an hour. I said, so what are you paying the new guys? He said, $14. Now, still doesn't sound like a lot to me or you, but that's like a 30-odd% increase. And I think even here in Canada, as in some of the provinces where you're seeing restaurants reopen and hospitality in general, they're having trouble getting people. And ultimately, if you can't get people, I'm not sure why, honestly. Maybe it's government programs, like some people say. I don't know. Maybe it's just demographics. There aren't enough young people around that are willing to take those kind of jobs. Don't know. But ultimately, the only way you get more people is to raise the wages.
Right. And I think that's another big component that we're probably not talking enough about, but what actually happens with labor inflation and wages. And if that happens, Ed, I mean, that really changes the paradigm and the dynamic in terms of, again, valuations and interest rates, and the Fed perhaps having to play catch up.
Absolutely. I agree with you. And we've seen it in the construction industry, where, as I mentioned, for 5 years, we've seen pretty big increases, and they were largely labor driven. Some material increases like concrete, lately steel and wood. But before that, it was largely labor driven. I remember about 2 years ago, it's totally unionized, the construction industry in the GTA, and there was going to be a strike, and they were making some serious demands, including the crane operators, who are not easily replaceable because it takes, quite frankly, several years to train a crane operator. And this might surprise you, but a good crane operator, and there's been a lot of them, they can now make $250,000 a year.
That does surprise me.
Yeah, no, it's first of all, it's a very skilled job. I mean, and a lot of safety issues. Got a lot of lives in those hands, and you're up there for 8 hours a day in a booth. I mean, it's not the most pleasant job in the world, and very stressful. Anyway, they get paid a lot, and bottom line was that the Construction Association essentially gave them whatever they wanted because they couldn't afford
choice.
to be shut down.
Yeah. And with respect to whatever does happen with interest rates and inflation, I think that is also the unknowns that are going on in the world right now. I think that so many people actually feel more comfortable buying property, buying real estate for the long term, that it is a store of value, that it feels good to own something that feels solid. What is that an accurate and a smart way to be thinking? I mean, obviously, time frame and time horizon has a lot to do with it as well. But if in fact we get an inflation spike in 2022 or what have you, presumably real estate prices go down, but there are so many other dynamics going on in the world today. So how do you see that?
Real estate prices may go down for a little bit because people want higher returns and so on. But long term, in a country like Canada, I mean, notwithstanding some of the issues that we're dealing with politically, it's still seen around the world as an extremely stable country, an extremely democratic country with a welcoming immigration process, and not the volatility, if you will, of what goes on even south of the border in the United States. I mean, as much I have maybe strong feelings politically that we won't get into, but if you really parse the positions of a Aaron O'Toole and a Justin Trudeau, they're different, not that different. Nobody's looking to turn the country upside down like a Donald Trump did, or a Biden who may be going, somewhat extreme the other way. We don't have those kind of extremities in our major political parties, and you can take that right down, to municipal and provincial. So it's a stable country in that way. We abhor violence, and I mean, I think we're too violent as it is, but we abhor it. So having said that, Canada is still going to be a good place to invest money in real estate internationally. As you say, you have to have, I learned one thing in the early 90s living through that. Debt can kill you when you're an owner of real estate. The people who survived and ultimately very much thrived subsequent to the meltdown of the early 90s, where you had high interest rates, lack of liquidity. I mean, everything was bad. When I tell the young guys at RIOCAN what it was like then, and like they can't imagine it really, because you still had double-digit interest rates in the early 90s with no business going on. I mean, that's why it was such a bad recession, particularly for real estate. But the people who had very low levels of debt survived it no problem. So, people, particularly if they're an investor, they have to really be careful. Now, having said that, I have been the biggest surprise out of the pandemic to me. A lot of it I found quite predictable, but there has been the unbelievable rise in real estate. Places like Muskoka, any of the sort of recreational property hubs, with Muskoka obviously at its center because some ways it's the smallest and perhaps most desirable. But the prices of single family homes in the far suburbs has shocked me. Like I said, in Oshawa, we have pretty good. We're selling townhouses in Oshawa. I couldn't believe how much we're getting for them. And the on top of it, the one that really surprised me, because it's largely investor driven, is the high-rise condominium market. It's been extremely strong.
Really?
There seems to be the odd sort of little bump here and there. But I'm sitting down here in Yorkville right now. Okay, that's where we live. There's a building being built at closer to Yonge Street, east of Bay, that RIOCAN owns 50% of, 62 stories, and it's all sold. I think we have 3 penthouse units left, and one of those went 2 weeks ago. There's a new building starting right next door to it at 33 Yorkville. Ours is 11 Yorkville. I know the kind of prices they're looking at. I don't think they're coming to market for another few months yet, but they're looking at like $2,000 a foot.
Wow.
A year ago, nobody would have dreamed of that. And I could go on, but I won't bore you with that. But even in the suburbs, Mississauga, I know about $1,000 a foot plus. Markham, up around where we have a big shopping center, Colossus, and the subway got brought up there. And there's a whole sort of, it's called Transit City, and they're getting $900,000 a foot, which nobody would have dreamed of even 18 months ago.
Well, right. And Ed, even I think, though, in the communication and the narrative in the media today, people don't necessarily know those numbers or know that that's the dynamic going on. I mean, we need to hear from someone like you to understand that that's the truth. And I say that in the sense that, a lot of people say everyone's moving out of the city. Everybody wants to live in the country. You and your team at RIOCAN, I mean, you have a lot of mixed use property. You've moved into the residential space, the condo space. So what do you say to those people and that story that gets told perhaps without seeing the numbers? I'm always a big believer in looking at the numbers.
Yeah. You know what? What we see is there is some of that happening. Because I think some people have this belief, and there are certain jobs that you'll be able to do this, that, hey, I can work from home the rest of my life. What's the difference if I live in Orangeville? Where for $1 million, I can buy a 4-acre piece of property with room for my kids and this and that. Well, there's 2 things. Number one, you really probably won't be able to work from home for the rest of your life. As I can tell you that most senior executives that I speak to, as here in Toronto anyway, and I don't think it's any different anywhere else. Again, if anything, the United States is ahead of us. By September, call it post-Labor Day, when the kids are back at school, people are expecting people to be back in the office, period. Now, it may not be 100%, maybe it'll be 3 or 4 days a week, at least to start. But I just know in talking to senior people that people who don't come back to the office will be looked at askance. It's necessary for cultural reasons, for collaborative reasons, for a whole bunch of things. I mean, even such a small thing. So once that small thing is walking down the hall and say, hey, what do you think about? And you can't do that when you got to set up a Zoom meeting to have a discussion.
Right.
So when that starts to happen, people say, maybe it's not such a good idea. Now I got to commute from Orangeville. And I don't know why I'm picking on Orangeville. It's a nice town. They'll also find, and it's boring. I mean,
good point.
I live in the middle of the city here and I love it. And, I mean, maybe we got used to being bored a little bit over the last 14 months. I mean, a big night is some food being delivered and watching some Netflix. I mean, because there's nowhere to go, which I think is the government's intention, to give you nowhere to go. But that will change. And again, I hope by the fall, there'll be lots of places to go. I know talking to some people at the MLSE, they are really hoping, I mean, the basketball season starts typically in October, towards the end of October. And they are at the moment planning to have a basketball season in Toronto. That would mean, now, whether it'll happen, don't know. But they expect it will. That'll mean, that the border between Canada and the US is open without quarantines when you come home, particularly if you're vaccinated, which, certainly all the sports figures are. But I can tell you, I came home, the fact that I'm fully vaccinated meant nothing.
Yeah.
The guy at the border, who came on the plane, I said, I'm fully vaccinated. He said, that's nice.
Yeah. I know, Ed. Look, I'm quarantining in Muskoka. I was in Florida. I'm fully vaccinated. The exact same thing. And, and the problem is there's just no system. There's no logistics put in place for that person to actually take that question and answer. No. And therefore, we don't have to waste government money with somebody checking in on me up at the cottage. But this is where we're at.
Did they actually show up at your cottage? I mean, we've had it. We got it on the 8th day.
Yeah, I hear it's the 8th day. And I haven't seen anybody yet. I almost feel neglected.
Okay. Well, I have a friend.
Maybe it'll happen now.
I have a friend of mine who's quarantining at his cottage at Lake of Bays, and he actually got visited.
Yeah.
So anyway, but going back to what we were saying. So small towns they don't have the entertainment and socializing opportunities that big cities do.
Yeah.
And they also don't have the economic opportunities that big cities do. And which is why big cities became big cities.
Absolutely. And it goes back to people actually wanting to be together and wanting to congregate, going back to the beginning of time.
Right.
But Ed, interesting, because people who are actually buying those condos now, and obviously doing really well on the sales front, who are they? Like, they're obviously of the same mindset that you are, but are they perhaps people with some investment dollars and they're buying 3, or like, who's thinking this way? Is what I'm kind of curious.
I can answer that a little bit just by the 11 Yorkville, which is the most recent experience. I would say about 60 to 65% of them are investors who are using largely cash, and they're choosing to invest in an apartment in Yorkville rather than putting it in the stock market or the bond market. Just leaving it in the bank. And they have a long-term faith. I mean, notwithstanding, a building like that, if you talk to most condo builders, they're saying the worst thing you can have is a building that's ready to move in. Because, when somebody is buying a condominium unit in downtown, they're betting on what the world's going to be like 4 years from now, or 3.5 years from now.
Got it.
Because we're not delivering any of those apartments until 2024/25. So, you're when you look at it in a way from the fact that you haven't really bought an option because you have committed, and the deposits are pretty big, or 20% of the purchase price ultimately. And so it's not an option, but you're making a bet on what the world is going to look like in 4 years. And right now, the investors that are betting that money are betting that, there'll be people that move to Orangeville, but not too many. People who want to still live where the action is, where they can get to work easy, and work is still going to be in the towers that we see, whether it's downtown or at Yonge and Bloor.
Got it. And just as an aside here, in terms of, thinking people are going to be, wanting to be in a city again, when you do look at the impact that COVID has had, and people perhaps wanting cottages and maybe wanting a place in Florida, maybe being elsewhere in the world, is there any other kind of geography that you think is an interesting investment at this point outside the Canadian borders?
Sorry?
Outside of the Canadian borders.
Outside of the Canadian border.
Yeah. Or maybe inside.
Yeah. You know what? Europe, to me, I mean, and again, I'm displaying my own political leanings. Europe, to me, it's done. Okay.
Okay.
I mean, I happen to be my most favorite city to go outside of Canada and outside of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, which, I really like, is London, England. I've spent a lot of time there. I love it there. And, but they're leaving the EU. It's London and England in general has changed, and I'm not sure it's going to go back to where it was. If I had to say there was a city outside of Canada, and then I'll come back to inside, I'd invest in, quite frankly, Miami, Austin. Miami City, I think is booming, but I think it's going to continue. It's always been the crossroads to South America, but they have a low tax rates. They have, except for a couple of months in the summer, pretty good weather.
Yeah.
All year round. And it's very diverse in many, many ways. And I know there's a guy I know who, excuse me, has a hotel down there, has built a couple of condos. The condo is half hotel, the hotel is half condo. And he spent a huge amount of money to buy a piece of property, which actually like a 2-story motel next to his main property. And I remember talking to him. I had dinner with him about 3 years ago. I said, "What the hell are you going to do with this, Jules?" and I said, "You paid a fortune for this thing." He says, "Yeah, but here's what I can build." I said, "But who are you going to sell it to?" Because the prevailing wisdom down in Miami, Miami Beach in particular, was, okay, 4 years ago, we lost all the Russians because Putin said owning property in the United States is unpatriotic. And he says, plus, some of my actual residents were on the American sanctions list, so that was a problem. and then he said to me, he says, then we lost most of the South Americans because their economies all went in the tank, whether it was obviously the big one, Venezuela, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico. I mean, their economies just went in the tank. He says, and then we lost a lot of Canadians. Now, this was 3-4 years ago because their currency was crap. Now, currency's made a pretty good recovery. I actually think it's too high right now, but that's just my view. And the dollar was around 70 cents, so it was very expensive. He says, so we're not getting that many Canadian buyers right now. I said, so I related to him that conversation we'd had a few years prior. I said, who's buying? He said, people from New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts.
Wow.
And Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
That's who's buying. And he says, and I'm 90% pre-sold.
Amazing.
So, there's a huge movement. I mean, Goldman Sachs for their in West Palm Beach just did a deal for a 500,000 foot office building. So, so that's what here in Canada, I think you have to have some patience, but I still love Calgary. I may be the only person who loves Calgary other than Jason Kenney.
Right.
But I think, the values are very reasonable. What we haven't seen, I mean, Calgary's been in an economics downspin probably for 5 years already.
Yeah.
And, their provincial economy is going to be helped a little by the comeback we've seen in oil prices. I think they really are working hard at diversifying some of their things. Their agricultural sector is booming. And the one thing, I mean, I still remember the last meltdown in Alberta back in the 80s. Maybe it was even late 70s when the national energy policy came in, Trudeau Sr.
Yeah.
And what suddenly you saw in Toronto was all kinds of cars with Alberta license plates. Again, anecdotal, wild rose country. And, like all over, you don't see them this time. And what we're seeing in the actual numbers is that the Albertans are not leaving. And so that to me is a very good sign. I think things are going to pick up there. And let's put it this way. I wish I could tell you RIOCAN's buying in Alberta right now. We're not, but we're not selling either.
Got it. And when you talk a little bit about though, and look at where you guys have transitioned the company in terms of more mixed use, what's the thinking behind that? Why did you make that move a number of years ago?
Yeah, well, number one is because we own the land. We owned the land, and we saw that the demand for retail space was at best staying flat, maybe even declining. But even when it's staying flat in a growing population country, it's declining. So we looked and said, well, what are our greatest assets? And the greatest assets were the locations of our shopping centers. By definition, they were at high traffic intersections. They ended up being, every time a new transit line is announced, we always have shopping centers on that transit line. And so we wanted to densify the sites, and the cities were all in favor of it. So that's what led to it. And as we saw some weakness happening in retail, we wanted to diversify. And the best way to diversify was building on land we already owned. Residential, I mean, at the end of the day, offices may come and go in popularity, retail comes and goes. Everybody needs a roof over their heads. And, nobody wants to sleep out in the rain by choice. And so residential, as long as you've got a growing population, longer term is always going to be great. And mixed use, it's a great phrase, but one of the properties we bought in 2007 called Young Eglinton Center was a mixed use development built in the 1970s. There's 1,000 up, but we don't own them, unfortunately, because they've been split off by the time we bought it. There's 1,000 apartments on that block. There's 750,000 feet of office space as part of the Young Eglinton, which we do own, and 300,000 feet of retail. And now we've added 1,500 apartments across the street, a little more retail, and an underground tunnel connecting them. So you can see, it's actually perfect from a work from home crowd, because they don't have to go anywhere.
Right. Yeah.
And just go across the street, and you'll see the power of the mixed use, because everything feeds on each other. When we're RIOCAN's building the well, which should finally start getting finished next year, there's going to be about 3,000 people that live on site, and about 4,000 people, maybe even more, that work on site. So the retailers in there, well, they got 10, 11,000 customers that are upstairs, so to speak. So everything feeds off each other. So to me and to our team, mixed use just makes all kinds of sense. And it's even environmentally sound.
Right. And I want to get your take as well. You used the word politics a couple of times, and maybe we don't talk about politics, but policies.
Okay.
So, but no, I'll talk about politics.
Okay.
But let's just take a look at what's gone on with COVID and the policies that have been implemented, because I think that people have been disappointed, whether it was the vaccine rollout, the lack of vaccines, you name it. How do you see the policies and what kind of impact they're having on people? I think is important. At the end of the day, if you're in business, you need to care about people.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And people are being hurt. The hurt is being disguised by the government shoveling money at almost everybody. I keep telling the guys at RIOCAN, the team there, that, we haven't seen that much fallout in retailers, considering that for the last 2 months, 20% of our retailers have been closed. But when you're going to see the fallout is when the government spigot gets turned off, which right now I think they're talking about turning it off in September. The rent subsidies and so on, and the extra payments to people. So I think the policies, starting from the very beginning, and I don't know, you could probably go back. I'm not going to blame the current federal government for everything, because somehow we've beaten up on our pharmaceutical industries for the last 25 years to the point where we don't really have one anymore.
Right.
And but even what we do have, I had a very good friend of mine who unfortunately passed away in very bad circumstances, Barry Sherman, who owned Apotex and built Apotex from the ground up, the largest generic drug manufacturer. And he did nothing ever but complain to me about how he was treated by the government at every level. He said all they want to do, because essentially the government now pays for most drugs. Whether, notwithstanding they want to have a national pharmacare program, the greatest amount of drugs are taken by those over 65. And you'll find out in many years. But it's quite incredible if you look at the numbers, and they get it for free. Everybody over 65 gets their prescription as long as it's on the formulary that the various governments expand, which has the negative impact of preventing Canadians having access to some of the newest medications. We don't get them. Or if we do, we have to pay for them. But mostly we just can't get them. You got to go to the States to get them. And so that's another problem. But because the government was paying for them, they had one interest: beating down the price. And that's what my friend Barry was always complaining about. And to the point where nobody felt like manufacturing anything here. And so, I can't blame the current governments for that. It's been a long-term thing. But what I can blame them for is being very slow off the mark in signing contracts for the acquisitions of vaccines. I mean, the current government in Ottawa thought they could do a deal with China. Really? and they wasted months, from what I've read, before they actually got serious and got a hold of people at Moderna and Pfizer. And contrast that with another country, Israel, that also had no, they have a big generic drug company. Theirs is Teva. We had Apotex. I can tell you from talking to some of Barry's heirs, nobody at the government ever called them saying, "Hey, can you make this?"
Really, Ed? Really?
Never called them.
How is that even possible?
You know what? They didn't. Maybe they didn't want to deal with. I can't explain government behavior, but Israel, and they knew Teva couldn't make this stuff. I mean, it's quite well known that the Prime Minister of Israel must have called the CEO of Pfizer 30 times over a period of 2 weeks to make a deal. And at the time he paid a high price, although I suspect it's never really been revealed. We paid a much higher price because we were late to the party, but he paid a high price, and he was questioned about it in their parliament, and he said, "Hey," he said, "you know what? The additional cost that I paid to get an immediate supply, maybe it's equal to the losses of 2 days of lockdowns."
Wow.
So I don't care what it costs.
Yep.
But we didn't do that. We were at the back of the line. I think the rollout, certainly here in Ontario, but probably right across Canada, after the opening stumbles, which you always expect. I mean, from God, when you say policy, I am a skeptic when it comes to government's ability to do stuff. And Canada in particular, we don't know how to do stuff by government. Milton Friedman, the famous economist, once said, and he was an American, where the government is a little better at doing stuff, I think. He once said, if you gave government ownership of the Sahara Desert, within 5 years, you'd have a shortage of sand. And, so there were lots of bumps. I mean, you remember the original website. I mean, it took forever. Mm-hmm. How hard is that? You'd think you could buy something off the shelf. But I mean, if you talk to most people, the biggest benefit has been this voluntary group, vaccinehunters.ca, which a bunch of volunteers set up that website. And so government performed in the rollout, I think, as well as they might have been expected to. I think what we've seen is a lack of leadership, where people, particularly at the provincial level, but also the municipal, leaders are supposed to lead. And, in many ways, I think the world of most of our current provincial leadership. Mm-hmm. I love their policies, but, writing a letter to a whole bunch of diverse groups telling me, what should I do about schools? Well, as one would have expected, he got all kinds of different opinions.
Right.
He still has to make the decision. Today is Tuesday, June the 1st. They haven't made the decision. I mean, school is over in 3.5 weeks. Whether they're just going to there's been a lack of decisiveness, a lack of leadership. I mean, I remember at the beginning of April, he announced that salons were going to open on April 12th. And then not within a week later, everything was closed, including golf courses and playgrounds. And so it's just been which he apologized for that and saying police were going to stop you on the street and ask you where you're going. But I think you've seen that right across the country, just a lack of leadership and an inability to do stuff. The actual policies, I think our children and grandchildren are going to be paying for those policies for a long time because, I keep hearing the justification from our Minister of Finance and Deputy Prime Minister Freeland. Interest rates are low. Well, she's right. They are low. Money is almost free, which has been driving a lot of the things that we talked about earlier. But they won't stay that way. And you run up $1 trillion of debt, which I think we have.
Yep.
And that's at the Canadian level, never mind the provinces. 1 percentage point. I'm trying to do the math now in my head, but it's billions of dollars. Let me see. I think it's about $10 billion a year.
Sure.
And I may be missing a zero. And, at a certain point, the world won't buy your bonds, and the Bank of Canada can't keep buying them all. And that's what happened to Canada and back in the Martin years. And it was pretty ugly getting out of it. And, the health care situation was dramatically impacted because they got out of it by knocking back the transfers to provinces and cutting back on the civil service, which somehow it's like a beanstalk. It just keeps growing anyway. It doesn't matter how much you try to cut it back. But I don't know if you saw a number that the federal government has spent something like $16 billion on consultants.
Yes, I did.
And which will tell you that the people running things really don't know how to do stuff. So they got to go out and hire somebody that maybe knows how to do stuff. And it's just, I just find the whole thing disheartening. And the policies, look, we needed dramatic policies going into this pandemic. But it's been carried out, I think, even the fact, I think they gave out $250 million to people by mistake. And now they've said, nah, you can keep it.
Right.
It was sort of our fault because we gave you bad information.
Right. So, Ed, when we think about going forward, for people listening to think about what do we need to demand, quite frankly, from our federal government officials and our provincial government officials, municipal, what have you. What would be the 3 top things you would say? I mean, because a lot of the time when we talk about business and economy, that Canada's not competitive enough on a number of different fronts, that there's too much red tape. I don't know. I think that people gloss that over when they, quite frankly, go to the polls, but it is what matters to our economic prosperity, specifically if we do have $1 trillion in deficits and interest rates might rise. So, yeah, and we do. So what's your message?
You know what? I've always felt the important things that a government, first of all, they got to cut back on regulation and make the process of getting things done easier. I can speak to construction. To get a site that is relatively uncontroversial as far as neighborhood and so on, from start to actually putting a shovel in the ground, is plus or minus 3 years. That's crazy.
What should it be? What should it be?
It should be less than a year.
Okay.
The amount of time. How long do you need to look at a plan? How many public meetings do you have to have? How many planning officials have to opine on whether this building is appropriate or well designed or not well designed? How much park? And Doug Ford, God bless him, he's tried to streamline the process, but the bureaucracy at the municipalities is almost immovable. And so if you want to build buildings, and I'm talking about industrial buildings as well. I'm not just talking about high rise. Everything takes forever. Even the length of construction now. I mean, COVID has exacerbated it. Like to get inspectors to come to a site, because you can't move from one phase to the next. Like you can't put up drywall, for example, being simple, till the electrical's been inspected. So suddenly you got to sit there because the electrical inspector didn't show up. And so the pandemic has really made things worse on that. But regulation, I hear starting a business is impossible. Government red tape, at least it's not corrupt. I mean, we don't have that problem that a lot of other countries have. It's just way too complex. And I think the governments have to work on simplifying Canadian entrepreneurs and letting them do business. Secondly, I think we've underinvested in education. If I'm taking a knock at teachers unions, I will. They take too much of the money. And if you look at the quality of our education, I went to public school. I don't know if you did.
I did both.
Okay.
I did both.
But I can tell you, my kids didn't, and I have 9 grandchildren. None of them go to public school, and it's not just an issue of having the economic capability of sending them. I know friends of theirs, of my kids' friends, who make enormous sacrifices not to be in the public school system, and so I think the quality of the public school system has been going down for a long time. What's going on in our universities, I think in some ways governments are doing a good job. I mean, Jim Flaherty, may rest in peace, started a university in Oshawa, which was his riding, which is now called Ontario Tech. And it's up to 10,000 students, and they teach nothing but STEM subjects. And so they're doing some good things. But I just think in education, right from pre-grade 1 to graduate school, we got to invest more. And last but not least, on the capital side, we have to make it easier for money to hook up with businesses. Because what unfortunately seems to happen, with some great exceptions, like Shopify, you have entrepreneurs that start companies, and if it's a really good thing and it's got lots of growth runway, some American or somebody else in the world is going to buy it, and we're happy to take the money. I have to admit, most Canadians, they're happy to take the money.
Yeah.
But so there's not enough. There's startup is getting better, but we have to fix our tax system to encourage more into entrepreneurship. We have to fix the if anything, we're going the wrong way because they're talking about taxing capital gains.
Right.
And the whole policy of how does one of my granddaughters put it? Granddad, today is about eating the rich. I got a budding socialist in my family, but I said, but the rich are just a product of the system. And if you don't continue to produce rich people, it'll all fall down because it means business isn't happening. And then nobody's going to make a living. And I think too many people in Canada, including many in our government, don't understand anymore how an economy actually creates wealth, and just figures the government can create wealth. Well, they can't. They can only borrow it or tax it. That's all they can do to get money. Anyway, you've got Ed's wish list.
I love it. Ed, I have 2 questions left because we're going to wrap this up, and I so appreciate your thoughts and information. It's amazing. One, we've kind of gotten your sense, but what is your view on the economy right now?
It's on a sugar high.
Okay.
The sugar being money, cash. And, if you talk to any bankers, and I think the numbers bear this out, bank deposits are like at an all-time high. And whereas borrowing, they're having trouble putting the money out. When I was on the Royal Bank Board for, hard to believe, a decade, one thing that was always constant was the amount outstanding on credit cards. Very lucrative business for all the banks because they charge a pretty good interest rate on that. But it was consistent. You know, I found it amazing. And it's gone down this year. People are paying off those high interest rate credit cards because, you know what, I think what's happened over the last 14 months is two things: a lot of government money and nowhere to spend it. I mean, you know, who goes out to a restaurant? You can't. Nobody travels. Who's gone to Europe in the last 15 months? Nobody.
Right.
You know, it's really, how many car trips haven't been made down to the United States? Thousands, hundreds. So money has accumulated. And even I know my own kids. Well, none of their kids went to summer camp last year. Boom, saved a lot of money by that happening. So
yeah,
cash has piled up. So that's what I mean by a sugar high right now that will last by, I think we're good for at least 12 months of a strong economy. And the party pooper will maybe an interest rate shock rate because of the inflation that's caused by the breakdowns in the supply chain that, are so well documented. I don't really understand why that's happened. But I can tell you, I have friends in the import business who tell me the cost of renting a container has tripled if you can get one.
Right.
And they're importing stuff from Asia all the time, and it's unbelievable. And yet Walmart won't let them raise their prices. So, something's going to give there.
Yeah.
So I think we're in for a good 12 months with some dark clouds represented by interest rates on the horizon, possibly.
Okay. And then lastly, Ed, in addition to all the information, I always think it's great to be able to get your perspective and people, your colleagues like yourself, something that's kind of a piece of advice, words of wisdom to be aspirational and inspirational to our viewers. Always, but also, of course, given COVID, I mean, had you, and people say that you've always been so approachable, and maybe that's one of the key reasons for your success. And maybe that's the question: what do you attribute your success to, and what would you pass on to our viewers?
Well, part of being approachable is because and this is what I tell the young people at RIOCAN. Of course, young is anybody below 50, but you never can stop learning. And to me, that's based, it has been for me. And one of the reasons maybe people think I'm approachable is I'm curious. I'm always curious about everything, like, why is this happening? And what is happening? I'm a news junkie for news around the world, because today, it's a small world, and something happening, oh, well, that's happening in Indonesia. You never know. It may tell you something. It may not. So I'm insatiably curious and insatiably wanting to learn more about everything. And I think that, particularly in today's world, is an essential for success, because when I say today's world, it's changing so quickly. And the other part of being curious is to be cynical about the information you get. And maybe because I find people believe everything they read. And I said, don't believe everything you read. Most of it is incorrect.
That is great advice, Ed. It's so wonderful to see you.
And it's great to see you.
Thank you. And to have a longer, in-depth conversation.
Yeah, this was, usually we're 7 minutes and goodbye.
I know, goodbye.
And I hope to see you up in Muskoka this summer.
Thank you. Absolutely, definitely.